Welcome back to Notes of Curiosity, exploring ideas that matter. I'm Alex.
I'm Eve.
Welcome to our deep dive into Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. We've got a mountain of fascinating material to cover, so
Oh, yeah.
it's big one.
Yeah.
Before we get too far, have you ever wondered, why history unfolded the way it did?
Oh, absolutely. Why some societies advance so much faster,
Right.
technologically, economically, and others, just didn't.
Yeah, and Guns, Germs, and Steel really tries to tackle these questions. But before we get into the content itself, let's talk a bit about the author, Jared Diamond.
Yeah, Diamond's not your typical, historian. This guy, he wears a lot of hats. He's a physiologist, an ornithologist, an evolutionary biologist, a geographer.
Yeah, he's
You know,
all over the place, a polymath.
Yeah, and it's really this, diverse background that informs his unique approach to understanding history.
He's definitely not afraid to cross disciplinary boundaries.
No, absolutely not. And it's this interdisciplinary approach that makes Guns, Germs, and Steel so interesting, so compelling.
Yeah.
Now, the whole book stems from a question that was posed to Diamond by Yallerly, a New Guinean politician. And this question is, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own?
It's a pretty direct question.
Yeah.
And it really gets to the heart of, it's such a huge question about global inequality.
Right.
And, how did our world become the way it is?
Exactly.
So how does Diamond set out to answer such a massive question?
Yeah, so he takes us back to 11,000 BC, the end of the last ice age. He calls this humanity's starting line. So by this point, Homo sapiens, we were already all over the place. We'd reached Australia and New Guinea 40,000 to 30,000 years ago.
Wow.
And just think about the skills they must have had, those early humans to navigate these vast oceans.
Yeah, I mean, the technology.
With the technology available at the time, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, how would they even do that?
Yeah. He even points out that these first people that reached Australia would have had to cross a minimum of 8 straits, separating Australia from Indonesian islands.
We were intrepid explorers, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And of course, humans also reached the Americas. Although the exact timing and routes are still debated, You've got theories swirling around about the Clovis people and even pre-Clovis settlements.
Right. So we have humans spread across the globe by this point. They're facing different environments, different challenges, different opportunities. So let me ask you, if an observer could have just stood back at 11,000 BC and looked at the world, could they have predicted which continents would develop, guns, germs, and steel first?
That's the million-dollar question, right? That's the question Diamond sets out to answer. And he argues that it's not about these inherent differences between people. He actually writes, he says, history followed different courses for different peoples because of differences among people's environments, not because of biological differences among peoples themselves.
So right off the bat, he's pushing back against these kind of racist theories that attribute European dominance to some inherent superiority.
Absolutely. He completely dismantles those theories and instead focuses on these environmental factors that gave certain societies a head start in history.
All right, so let's dive into those environmental factors. One of Diamond's main arguments revolves around the power of food production.
Right. He argues that this transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding, was a monumental turning point in human history. In fact, he writes that food production was indirectly a cause of guns, germs, and steel through its effects on the density and stability of human societies and on the technology available to them.
So it's not just about, having more food to eat. It's about these kind of cascading effects that agriculture had on societies.
Exactly. So food production, it led to these sedentary lifestyles. People were able to settle in one place, cultivate crops. This, in turn, allowed for larger populations and more complex social structures. And of course, with food surpluses, you have specialization. You have craftspeople. You have rulers. You have soldiers who don't have to spend all their time just, out hunting or gathering.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about how something as, seemingly simple as farming, just growing your own food, could have such a profound impact on the course of history.
It's true. And one of the key arguments that Diamond makes is that the uneven distribution of suitable wild plants and animals for domestication across continents was a key factor in why food production arose independently in some regions but not others.
So wait, not all plants and animals are created equal when it comes to domestication.
Right. Exactly. And actually, Diamond spends a good portion of this book exploring this concept. And he points out that only a tiny minority of wild plant and animal species has been successfully domesticated. And it turns out that Eurasia, compared to the Americas or Australia, had a disproportionate share of those domesticable species.
So that's a pretty big advantage right out of the gate for those societies.
Absolutely. And he uses this fascinating concept called the Anna Karenina principle.
The Anna Karenina
Plato.
principle. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's so he borrows this idea from Tolstoy's novel, which famously begins with the line, "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." And Diamond applies this logic to domestication, right? So he's arguing that successful domestication requires a confluence of favorable traits.
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit. Like, what are some of the crucial traits for an animal to be successfully domesticated?
Sure, sure. Well, for one thing, they can't have a lot of deal breakers. They need to be adaptable. They need to be manageable. Certainly not prone to biting the hand that feeds them. So, for instance, think about zebras. They're closely related to horses, but they've never been successfully domesticated.
Why not? I mean, zebras seem like they'd be just as useful as horses for transportation and other tasks.
Well, Diamond points out that zebras have a couple of characteristics that make them incredibly challenging to domesticate. They've got, he says, a nasty disposition and a penchant for biting. And also, they're very skittish. They're prone to panicking in these unfamiliar situations, and those traits, which might be advantageous in the wild, make them less than ideal candidates for domestication.
So even though they might seem pretty similar at first glance, horses and zebras have these very different temperaments and behavioral patterns that have shaped their relationship with humans.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just animals. Plants have to meet certain criteria for successful domestication as well. They need to be relatively easy to grow, they need to produce a high yield, and they have to have edible
Yeah,
parts.
that makes sense. If a plant's too finicky or it produces these tiny, barely edible fruits, it's not going to be a good candidate for large-scale cultivation.
Exactly. And Diamond, he uses the example of almonds, which were one of the first crops domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. Now, wild almonds, they're actually bitter and poisonous. But, this chance mutation led to a sweeter, edible variety that humans could cultivate.
Wow, that's incredible. So you're saying this one single genetic quirk can have these huge ripple effects throughout history.
Absolutely. So back to Eurasia, its abundance of domesticable plants and animals, well, it gave those societies a head start in developing agriculture. And with agriculture, well, came all of those cascading benefits. Larger populations, sedentary lifestyles, food surpluses, and the emergence of specialization.
Yeah. So this initial advantage in food production seems like a pretty critical piece of the puzzle. How did that advantage spread?
Well, that's where Diamond introduces another crucial concept, continental axes. And he argues that this east-west orientation of Eurasia, it facilitated this rapid spread of domesticated crops and animals, which in turn influenced the development of complex societies, technology, and political organization.
Hold on. Continental axis. I think I'm going to need a little more explanation on that one.
Well, okay. Okay, so picture a map. Eurasia, it stretches primarily from east to west, while the Americas and Africa are oriented north to south. This seemingly simple, geographical difference, well, it had a huge impact on the diffusion of crops, animals, technology, and even ideas.
So you're saying it's not just about the total landmass of a continent, but also its shape and its orientation.
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine, those early farmers in the Fertile Crescent. That's one of the cradles of agriculture. And they domesticated wheat, barley, other crops that thrive in a particular climate and day length. As those farmers migrated east or west across Eurasia, well, they encounter similar climates, similar environments.
So those crops could adapt and thrive in those new locations fairly easily.
Right. And as agriculture spread, so too did the knowledge and technologies associated with it. But now, picture those same farmers trying to migrate north or south. Well, they would run into very different climates, different day lengths, all these different ecological barriers.
That makes sense. I mean, a crop that flourishes in the Mediterranean climate of the Fertile Crescent is going to have a much harder time in the colder, shorter growing seasons of Northern Europe or the hotter, more humid climates of Africa.
Yeah, and not only would those crops have trouble adapting, but the knowledge and techniques used to cultivate them, well, those might not be directly transferable either. So Diamond argues that this difference in continental axes played a significant role in shaping, the course of history.
So it's like a a geographical bottleneck
Yeah.
where, innovations and ideas could throw pretty easily across Eurasia, but they face more obstacles in spreading north or south in the Americas and Africa.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So this east-west axis of Eurasia, well, it allowed for more rapid and interconnected development compared to the Americas and Africa, where this north-south orientation created more fragmented patterns of development.
Okay, so we've got food production and continental axes as these two key environmental factors that shaped early societies.
Yeah.
But what about the germs and the steel part of the equation?
Ah, well, those are coming up next. And they're intertwined with these foundational factors in some fascinating and sometimes unsettling ways.
Okay, now you got me really curious. I guess we'll just have to wait for the next part to explore the role of germs and steel in shaping history.
Sounds good. Welcome back. So, we've been kind of laying the groundwork here, understanding how these differences in food production and continental axes played this pivotal role in these, the divergent paths of societies. So now let's tackle the germs part of the equation, which gets a little bit unsettling, I think.
Yeah, it's a reminder that history isn't always, this triumphant march of progress. There's some pretty dark chapters, and the impact of disease is definitely a prime example of that.
Yeah. And Diamond's exploration of disease it's both fascinating and sobering at the same time. He argues that the rise of agriculture, with these larger populations and these close proximities to domesticated animals, well, this created this ideal condition for the evolution and spread of deadly pathogens.
So it's almost counterintuitive. You think that with progress comes better health, but in this case, it seems like agriculture inadvertently unleashed a whole new wave of threats.
Yeah. And Diamond makes this point that the crowd diseases that first evolved after the rise of agriculture, such as smallpox and measles, were among humanity's most horrific killers. So think about the impact of a disease like smallpox on populations with no prior immunity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a stark reminder of how vulnerable populations can be to these diseases that they've never encountered before. We've seen this throughout history and even in recent times with these outbreaks like the Zika virus.
Yeah. And Diamond calls this the immunologic handicap of the New World, right? So Eurasian populations, due to their long history of agriculture, these dense populations, close contact with domesticated animals, well, they developed at least some level of immunity to these diseases. But when they ventured out, well, they unwittingly brought those pathogens with them with these just, absolutely devastating consequences.
So it's almost like Europeans had this biological weapon that they weren't even aware of. It's a chilling example of how these unintended consequences can really shape history.
Yeah, and it's a tragic but crucial part of the story. Diamond estimates that European diseases wiped out up to 95% of the Native American population, which is just a demographic catastrophe with lasting repercussions. And he writes, he says, the result was that by the time European settlers arrived in large numbers, most parts of the Americas were occupied by just remnants of their former dense populations.
Yeah. It's hard to even fathom the scale of that loss. It's not just about numbers. It's about entire cultures, languages, ways of life that were just decimated.
It's true, and it's a reminder of the interconnectedness of human history and these, really the unintended consequences of our actions. But Diamond doesn't just focus on this devastating impact of, Eurasian diseases. He also explores how disease transmission wasn't just this one-way street.
So you're saying Europeans weren't immune to everything?
No, absolutely not. Europeans also succumbed to diseases that they encountered in other parts of the world, particularly in tropical regions. And Diamond points out that malaria, for example, played a significant role in, actually hindering European colonization of Africa.
Yeah. It's a reminder that this relationship between humans and disease is really complex and it's constantly evolving.
For sure. For sure. And he emphasizes that disease has been a shaper of history and that understanding its role is crucial for making sense of these global patterns of conquest and colonization and social development. But, let's move on to steel. How did technology, particularly weaponry, factor into this equation?
Yeah, I'm ready to dive into the steel part of this.
Yeah.
We've already talked about how food production and these continental axes led to these larger populations, these more complex societies, and even specialization.
Yeah.
Did those advantages translate into technological superiority as well?
Yeah, that's exactly what Diamond argues. As these societies in Eurasia grew larger and more complex, fueled by these advantages that we've been discussing, well, competition and warfare, those became more frequent. And this, of course, spurred the development of new technologies, particularly in weaponry.
It's almost like an arms race, spurred by this need to either defend your territory or conquer your rivals.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly like that. Diamond, he writes, as for the proximate factors behind European expansion, guns, steel swords, and ocean-going ships were obviously important. And, remember those continental axes? Well, innovations spread really rapidly across Eurasia, which gave those societies this technological edge.
So while societies in the Americas and Africa were also developing technologies, the pace and the interconnectedness of innovation in Eurasia was just on a whole different level.
Yeah. And by the time Europeans began venturing out, on this global scale, well, they had this really substantial advantage in weaponry and technology.
Diamond gives this example of Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire. That must be just a textbook case of technological disparity.
Oh, yeah, it's a dramatic illustration of how technology can just completely tip the scales of power. So, in 1532, Francisco Pizarro, he's this Spanish conquistador, he led this small force of, I think, around 168 men against the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, who commanded an army of tens of thousands.
Wow. Just those numbers alone seem like an insurmountable mismatch. How did Pizarro even manage to pull off such a stunning victory?
Well, it was a combination of factors, right? There was deception, there was political intrigue, and yes, technology. So the Spanish had these steel swords, armor, horses, all of which were foreign to the Incas. And perhaps even more importantly, they had guns, which gave them this decisive advantage in combat.
Yeah. So even though the Incas were skilled warriors and they had this vast numerical advantage, they were just completely outmatched technologically.
Yeah. Diamond describes the scene really vividly. He writes, the Spaniards' steel swords, much tougher than the Incas' bronze weapons, sliced through Inca bodies, and the Spaniards' horses became battering rams that panicked the Incas. So it was a, brutal and decisive encounter.
Yeah. It's a tragic example of how technological superiority can just be this deciding factor in conquest.
Yeah. And remember, the technological advantages didn't just, appear out of thin air. They were the culmination of this long process of development fueled by the environmental factors we've been discussing.
So Diamond's really weaving together this compelling argument showing how food production, continental axes, germs, and steel all contributed to these divergent paths of societies throughout history. But he doesn't just rely on these broad generalizations, does he?
No, not at all. To solidify his argument, Diamond delves into these specific case studies, exploring how these factors played out in different contexts across the globe. And these real-world examples make his theories tangible, and they provide this much richer understanding of the complexities of history.
Yeah. I'm eager to hear about these case studies. They're like these mini deep dives within the larger deep dive of the book.
Exactly. And they span this, wide range of cultures and environments, from the Polynesian islands to the Bantu expansion in Africa to the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. So shall we explore a few of these fascinating case studies?
Let's do it. I'm ready to journey across the globe and see how these factors played out in different corners of the world. Okay, I'm ready for these case studies. Where do we start?
Let's start with one that really highlights the interplay of environment and human innovation. The comparison between Australia and New Guinea.
Yeah, I remember this one being fascinating. Two land masses, once connected, yet they have these, vastly different histories. New Guinea, despite its, rugged terrain, saw the independent development of agriculture, while Australia remained a land of hunter-gatherers for millennia. Why is that?
Well, Diamond attributes this to a few key factors. First, New Guinea has this much greater diversity of domesticable plants, including taro root, bananas, sugarcane, all staples that could support larger populations.
So right off the bat, New Guinea had a more abundant and diverse pantry to work with compared to Australia.
Exactly. And the mountainous terrain of New Guinea, that played a role too. Those isolated valleys, they created these pockets where different groups could experiment with cultivation techniques, almost like, separate laboratories of innovation.
That's interesting. So it's like the geography itself encouraged this more localized and diverse approach to food production.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And perhaps most importantly, New Guinea had a head start. Agriculture developed there independently, thousands of years before Australia was even settled.
So by the time humans arrived in Australia,
Yeah.
they were already accustomed to this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And they encountered an environment that, while vast, didn't offer the same abundance of easily domesticable plants.
Yeah, and that's a key point. Diamond argues that the timing of human arrival and the pre-existing knowledge base can really significantly influence how societies interact with their environments.
So it's not just about the environment in a vacuum. It's about the interplay of environment, human knowledge, and historical timing. It's
Yeah.
making me rethink this whole notion of progress as this linear, inevitable thing.
Yeah. Diamond challenges those assumptions head on. He argues that history is contingent, it's shaped by this complex web of factors, not some, predetermined trajectory.
Okay, so New Guinea and Australia offer a compelling example of how environment and timing can influence a society's path. What about some other case studies? I mean, Diamond covers a lot of ground in this book.
Oh, he does.
Yeah.
Let's jump over to the Polynesian Islands. Diamond calls this region a natural experiment in human history.
Yeah, I remember this one. What makes Polynesia so unique?
Okay, so imagine this. You have a group of people sharing a common ancestry, and they spread across these islands with diverse environments, from lush volcanic peaks to these tiny coral atolls. And what happened next is just fascinating.
Okay, I'm all ears. What happened?
Well, within a relatively short span of time, Polynesian societies diverged dramatically.
Mhm.
Developing everything from hunter-gatherer bands to complex chiefdoms.
So even though they shared a common ancestry and is relatively small geographical area, the different environments of those islands led to very different social structures.
That's right. And Diamond provides some really vivid examples. You have the Chatham Islands, for example, where the Moriori people, they lived on this small, resource-limited island, and they developed this peaceful, pacifist society.
Yeah, I'm picturing this small island community where cooperation and sharing were just essential for survival.
Yeah, exactly. But now contrast that with their Maori cousins. They settled in New Zealand. That's a much larger, more resource-rich landmass. And they developed this warrior culture, with this intense competition for land and resources.
Wow, that's a stark reminder that even people with this shared ancestry can take very different paths depending on the environments they inhabit.
Absolutely. And Diamond connects this Polynesian natural experiment to his larger argument about continental differences. He's saying that the same principles that shape Polynesian societies, well, those also played out on a grander scale, across the globe.
So those continental axes we talked about earlier, those seemingly simple uh, geographical differences, they had this profound impact on the trajectories of societies, over thousands of years.
That's exactly right. And Diamond, he doesn't shy away from tackling some of the most complex and often controversial chapters of human history either. He explores the Bantu expansion in Africa, the conquest of the Americas, the rise and fall of ancient civilizations, always weaving in those environmental factors as these, key explanatory threads.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but it's incredibly thought-provoking. It's making me rethink everything I thought I knew about history.
Hmm.
It's not just about dates, battles, and great leaders. It's about these deeper, often overlooked factors that shape the possibility.
Yeah, and that I think is one of Diamond's greatest contributions. He's pushing us to look beyond the surface, to ask these why questions that get to the heart of how our world came to be the way it is.
And it's not just about the past either. Diamond makes these connections to contemporary issues too. Arguing that understanding these historical patterns is crucial for addressing these challenges like inequality and conflict in the present.
Yeah. He's arguing that history isn't just something we study, it's this living force that shapes our present and our future.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways from this whirlwind tour through history?
Well, I think Diamond's book is really a call for a more nuanced understanding of human history, one that moves beyond these simplistic explanations of racial or cultural superiority. He argues that these different trajectories of societies are deeply intertwined with these environmental factors, the starting conditions that shaped the possibilities for development.
So it's about acknowledging those environmental advantages and disadvantages and recognizing how they've played out over time, often with these unintended consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, the most powerful takeaway is just this sense of interconnectedness. Diamond shows us that human societies, despite their vast differences, well, they're all part of this larger web of life shaped by these same, environmental forces.
It's a humbling perspective,
Yeah.
and one that I think is essential for navigating the challenges of the 21st century.
Absolutely. And if you're, looking for a book that will make you think differently about the world, I highly recommend Guns, Germs, and Steel. It's challenging, but it's an ultimately rewarding read that'll stay with you long after you finish the last page.
So there you have it, our deep dive into Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. We've journeyed through time, grappled with these, really complex ideas, and hopefully gained a new perspective on the forces that have shaped human history.
Yeah. And just as Diamond's work continues to spark debate and discussion, we hope this deep dive has ignited some curiosity and some new perspectives for you as well.
Definitely. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this thought-provoking book.
This is Alex and Eve.
And join us next time as we explore another fascinating topic, guaranteed to make you think differently about the world around us.